Two people may desire the same end from a process for different reasons. And in penology, I think this distinction comes out really well in thinking of the reasons people think punishing criminals can have utility. And for some people, it's for the reason that those people suffer, whilst for others, it's that the suffering results in some positive, well, that the punishment results in some positive end for everyone. So whether it's deterrence or even keeping that person away from others. And I think one of the most elegant arguments I've seen in arguing for the utilitarian position on punishment is by H.L.A. Hart in Punishment and Responsibility, his essay. And I've been reading an essay on that essay by John Gardner. And I just want to read out the first chapter, which just reminded me of some of the brilliant arguments I was seeing in there. I think I'll just take it now. I didn't summarize what it is, but I guess it will come out. But he's essentially arguing that the point in punishing is not the suffering of the person that's, let's say, imprisoned, but rather the societal benefit that comes from it. All right, so I'll take it now. Crime and punishment. What good comes from criminal punishment? How does it help to make the world better, a better place? Criminal punishment, and more generally the criminal justice system, that makes it possible requires a huge investment of money, time, and energy. It has high costs and many casualties. And if the system is to be justified, there must be compensating benefits. We had better know what they are and establish whether they are sufficient. That simple thought permeates punishment and responsibility and animates the book's most widely remembered essay, Prolegomenon of the Principles of Punishment, which is chapter 1. Put like this, you may say, Hart's thought is not only simple but uncontroversial. Any action or practice that has costs, and which does not, needs to pay its way in countervailing benefits, or else it cannot be defended. The tricky question is, what counts as a countervailing benefit? Hart thinks that a reduction in future wrongdoing qualifies as a countervailing benefit, and criminal punishment, on page 8, on Passum, the law's punitive measures may contribute to this reduction in various ways, by deterrence, by public education, by incapacitation, by rehabilitation, and so on. But however it is brought about, the relevant benefit, thinks Hart, lies in the tally of future wrongs that will, thanks to the system, never be committed. The job of showing how much benefit there is in the system then shifts largely to the empirical researchers who are in a position to tally the uncommitted wrongs and can credibly be attributed to the punitive measures in question. Very Bentham-like. I wish Bentham succeeded. This explains Hart's emphasis on statistics concerning the effects of the death penalty in murder and the principles of punishment. The death penalty for murder, thinks Hart, can be justified only if, inter alia, thanks to its use as a sufficient number of murders, or at any rate a sufficient number of sufficiently grave wrongdoings, go uncommitted. But what about wrongs that have already been committed? Is it also a countervailing benefit of the criminal justice system that, thanks to its existence, wrongdoers whose wrongs are already fait accompli will suffer for their wrongs? Hart famously thinks not. For him, the suffering of the punished, okay, this is key. Hart famously thinks not. For him, the suffering of the punished wrongdoer, be he ever so guilty, is always at a cost and never a benefit of the criminal justice system. Indeed, the suffering of the punished wrongdoer is criminal punishment's most alarming cost, the one that creates the heaviest burden of justification for those who believe that the system should be maintained. On this point, as on several others, Hart sides with the classical utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. Contrary to the vulgar retributive theory of view that Hart plainly regards as barbaric, there is nothing intrinsically appealing about any kind of suffering, even when it is, this guy is really measured, even when it is punitively imposed. Hart would be a brilliant judge. And so any genuine appeal that lies in a system to impose such suffering must be an instrumental appeal. It must be based on whatever advantageous consequences the suffering has, including the avoidance of later suffering, not only the suffering itself. That's actually the most important sentence here. This broadly utilitarian approach of justifying punishment is sometimes called forward-looking, in contrast with the backward-looking retributive view. Hart draws the contrast in these very terms in Punishment and the Elimination of Responsibility, chapter 7 at page 160. But we can also see that in some ways, The terms are misleading. All justifications for punishment, indeed all justifications for anything, are forward-looking in the sense that they explain how the justified thing promises to make the world a better place, or at least to avoid its getting any worse. The special feature of the retributive view is not that it attempts to defy this axiom. If it were, the retributive view would be easy, or a lot easier than Hart finds it, to dismiss as irrational. The special feature of the retributive view is not that it attempts to defy the um, the special feature of the retributive view, rather, is that it finds some intrinsic, not merely instrumental value in a certain type of suffering, namely in suffering that is deserved. Yeah, I don't agree. The only backward looking feature of this view is a subsidiary feature. It comes of the distinctively retributive view about what makes suffering deserved. On the retributive view, suffering is deserved to the extent, and only to the extent, that it is borne by the guilty in proportion to and on the ground of their guilt, where guilt designates a relationship that a wrongdoer has or had to a wrong that she already committed. This suffering of the guilty is a good to be pursued, even if all other suffering is an evil to be avoided. You can see here a sense in which the retributivists are consequentialists, just like the classical utilitarians, and a sense in which they are not. They are consequentialists, just like the classical utilitarians, in that they identify good to be pursued, perhaps even ceteris paribus maximized. In their case, it is the good of suffering of the guilty, which the classical utilitarians regarded like all other suffering as an evil to be avoided. On the other hand, they're not consequentialists, and unlike the classical utilitarians, in that this good of theirs cannot be identified in an entirely action independent way. To identify certain suffering as suffering of the guilty and hence as retributively good, one must always identify the already committed wrong in respect of which wrong, as has already been said. Of course, the wrong in question might still be a wrong on utilitarian or more broadly instrumental grounds. It need not be an intrinsic wrong. The question of what makes the wrong a wrong in the first place is beside the point. The point is that the suffering is redeemed, turned from bad to good by its relationship to the doing of the wrong. In spite of this misleading formulation in chapter 7, then Hart's disagreement of the retributivists is not about whether a defense of criminal punishment must focus, in his own words, on, quote, the future good we can do to society, including the criminal, on page 159. Of course it must. The retributivist view agrees. The disagreement is about what counts as a relevant future good. As he makes clear in chapter 1, page 9, Hart finds it perfectly intelligible to cite suffering of the guilty as a quote generic justifying aim for the criminal justice system as a whole. A society could indeed pursue and even attempt to maximize such suffering as an intrinsic good. Hart's objection to this society is not that we cannot make sense of its practice. His objection is that its practice is immoral. Pursuing suffering of the guilty is an intrinsic good, as an intrinsic good is immoral because considered intrinsically, that is, aside from its consequences, suffering is always and only an evil. Oof. That's it.